To varying degrees, we all enjoy the services the government provides. Governments build the roads we drive on, manage the public forests we play in, inspect many of the foods we eat and the water we drink. Government provides schools, limits pollution, provides radar systems and air traffic control, maintains military, police, and other services to ensure the public safety. Government also provides incomes to the elderly and to those in need, breakfast to children who otherwise wouldn't eat, and housing to the otherwise homeless. Government insures our checking accounts, provides loans to businesses and to students, and regulates our financial institutions. How these services are provided and how they are paid for are the subjects of public finance. More formally, public finance refers to both government expenditures in allocating resources and how these expenditures are financed. There are three ways historically the government has financed its expenditures: land sales, debt, and taxes. In this program, we'll focus on taxes. No one wants to pay taxes, but most of us want government services. And while services such as public education are provided at no charge, they nonetheless cost money, so the government imposes taxes. Some argue that in a free society, the only fair tax is a voluntary one. In markets, for example, consumers voluntarily pay for things they enjoy. Ideally, the same concept applies to government services. Those who benefit pay. For example, people who drive pay for roads through gasoline taxes. People may choose not to pay the tax by simply not driving. But many of the services the government provides are public goods, goods that are generally unprofitable for private firms to produce. In this sense, the market can never provide public goods. A public good has two characteristics. First, in contrast to a private good, a public good is non-rival. That means one person's enjoyment of the good doesn't interfere with another person's enjoyment. Second, public goods are non-excludable. So once the good's provided, no one can be excluded from enjoying the benefits. National defense is the classic example of a public good. The security that one may derive from having a strong military doesn't preclude another from benefiting from that security too. The fact that people receive benefits without having to pay the costs is the reason why government has to impose involuntary taxes. There are simply no rational incentives for citizens to give resources to the government. So now that we know we have to pay taxes, what kind of tax should the government impose? For example, should the tax be progressive, regressive, or proportional? What principle should the tax be based on? Should those who benefit pay, or should those who have the ability pay? First, let's look at the different types of taxes: progressive, regressive, and proportional. The type of tax tells us whether it is largely borne by the poor or by the rich. Now, the easiest way to figure out the type of tax is to define the difference between marginal and average tax rates. This is just like we've seen before when looking at marginal and average cost curves or marginal and average revenue. Let's say that the average grade on a midterm exam was 80%. There are 10 students in the class. Mary, who took the exam late, receives 100%. Her grade is on the margin, but what impact does this have on the average? The average of 80 results from summing the students' scores and arriving at 720 and dividing by 9. Mary's score of 100 raises the total to 820. Dividing that total by 10 students, we get a new average of 82. Now let's assume that instead of 100, Mary received a 50 on her exam. The total rises to 770 and the average score drops from 80 to 77. Well, what do we conclude? If the marginal score exceeds the average score, the average rises, and if the marginal score falls below the average falls. It's the same with taxes. The average tax rate is the total tax divided by total income. The marginal tax rate is the increment in taxes over the increment in income. Your tax bracket refers not to your average tax, but to your marginal tax. Let's look at how we compute tax rates for a hypothetical friend, Harvey. Under a progressive tax, the first $10,000 Harvey earns, he pays $1,000 in taxes. So his average tax rate is 10% and his marginal tax rate is 10%. The average is found by dividing his total tax by his total income. The marginal tax rate is found by taking the increment in tax and dividing it by the increment in income. When Harvey's income increases from $10,000 to $20,000, his tax rises from $1,000 to $3,000. Dividing $3,000 by $20,000, we find that his average tax is 15%. His marginal tax is found by dividing the increment in the tax, $2,000, by the increment in his income, $10,000. So his marginal tax rate is 20%. With a progressive tax, the marginal tax rate exceeds the average tax rate as income goes up. With a proportional tax, the marginal tax and the average tax rates are the same. Now let's look at a regressive tax. Note that from $10,000 to $20,000, the tax rises from $1,000 to $1,800. The average tax rate is found by dividing $1,800 by $20,000 to arrive at 9%. But the marginal tax rate actually falls. Harvey's income rose by $10,000, but his tax rose by $800, so his marginal tax rate is 8%. What we've found is that with a progressive tax, the more income you earn, the more you pay as a percentage of income in taxes. With a proportional tax, there's no change. Regardless of the level of income, everyone pays the same percentage of income in tax. If Harvey earns $10,000 a year, he pays $1,000 in taxes. If Harvey made $1 million in income, he would have paid $100,000 in taxes. He pays more taxes as his income goes up, but the percentage of tax paid remains the same. Well, that's not the case with the regressive tax. With a regressive tax, as your income goes up, you pay a smaller percentage of your income in taxes. Notice that you still pay more taxes, but the percentage declines. So how do these different types of taxes apply? Is our income tax system progressive, proportional, or regressive? Well, look at the tax booklet mailed to you by the IRS. For the first $23,000 for a single person, the marginal tax rate is 15%. From $23,000 to $55,000, the tax rate jumps to 27%. So income tax is a progressive tax. The more you earn, the more you pay as a percentage of your income. Well, what about a sales tax? Many people believe that sales taxes on food are unfair because they are highly regressive. Well, here's why. Let's say we have two individuals, Harvey, who earns $10,000 a year. He spends all his income on things he needs, clothes, food, and shelter. Let's assume he pays $500 a year in sales tax. Harvey's friend, Howard, earns $100,000 a year. And Howard also must buy food and clothes and pays $2,000 in taxes. This is more than Harvey pays. But as a percentage, Howard pays less, so sales tax is regressive.
Historical Moments with John Watkins, Ph.D.
The government hasn't always used income as a primary tax base. During the 19th century, tax revenues were based on tariffs and land sales. Revenues from tariffs were paid by consumers of foreign products, whiskey, wine, and tobacco. Other revenues were generated by selling U.S. government assets. In the 19th century, southern and western farmers objected to high tariffs. High tariffs increased the prices of manufactured goods, and that benefited northern industrialists. No one objected to the land sales or land grants because the resources of the federal government appeared unlimited. The first income tax was enacted in 1861 to finance the Civil War. In 1864, Justin Morrill, a senator from Vermont, argued that the income tax represented the seizing of property for the crime of having too much. The financial needs of the war, however, overcame any ethical objections. The tax was removed in 1872. In the first decade of the 20th century, there was a major push to reduce the very high tariffs placed on imports. To make up the lost revenues, Congress enacted the first corporate income tax, a 4% tax on corporate profits. In 1909, President Taft suggested a constitutional amendment to enact the income tax. Riding the crest of the populist movement, the income tax was finally established by the 16th Amendment to the Constitution in 1913. The tax levied a 1% tax on all incomes above $3,000 for a single person and $4,000 for a married couple. A 6% surcharge was levied on very high incomes. Since the average personal income in 1913 was $621, only 2% of the population paid an income tax. During World War II, tax rates on personal income reached a high of 90%. Presently, the highest tax rate on income is 37%. For 75% of taxpayers, FICA taxes, which are taxes used to pay Social Security, exceed the income tax.
The early name for economics was political economy. That was the natural name because the founders of economic thought directed their attention to the role of government. Economies in the 18th century were rapidly expanding, and this was the time when markets were emerging as key institutions. Today, microeconomists debate the same fundamental issues that Adam Smith wondered about. What is the function of a government in a market economy? Why do we need governments if markets work so well? How are public decisions made in a democracy? Why do bureaucracies tend to grow? In this program, we examine the issues of public decision-making and lay the groundwork for understanding important public topics such as taxation, national defense, education, environmental protection, and welfare spending. In a free market economy, there are two fundamental reasons why governments exist. The first relates to the presence of income inequality, which we'll study in detail a bit later on. The second reason relates to market failure. Markets fail when they are not efficient. Efficiency relates to our earlier discussion of Pareto optimality. In theory, purely competitive markets are efficient. That means that there is no better mix of technology, inputs, or any sort of exchange that could improve the well-being of one person without hurting another. Now, when markets are inefficient, there's room for improvements or gains that don't harm any of the players. This sounds like a good idea, so let's explore how markets fail in the first place. Now, there are three sources of market failure. They relate to the existence of public goods, externalities, and market power. We've studied extensively how market power can bring about inefficiency. That happens when a firm, such as a monopoly, faces a downward sloping demand curve, so that it can affect the market price. When that happens, the price consumers pay is greater than the marginal cost of production. That implies an imbalance between marginal benefit and marginal cost. Prices and outputs aren't at their efficient levels, and that gives rise to the need for government antitrust regulation. Externalities occur when the actions of one firm or individual in a market have direct effects, either good or bad, on other firms or individuals in the market. Classic examples relate to bad or negative externalities, such as when a company pollutes the air or water in the process of production. When negative externalities are present in production, then market prices don't accurately reflect costs. The firm, by ignoring these costs, tends to overproduce. A large source of market failure occurs in the presence of things called public goods. Those are goods or services which have two particular characteristics. They are non-rival and non-excludable. Non-rivalry means that the consumption of the product by one person means there's not less of it to be consumed by another. For example, when you breathe clean air or enjoy national defense, there's no reduction in clean air or national defense for anyone else. By contrast, most products are private and are rival in consumption. So if you eat this hot dog, nobody else can. So to be rival, everyone can consume more benefits, and they're independent of the size of the population. Now, public goods are also non-excludable. One reason why a hot dog is a private good is that if the vendor can withhold it if the consumer doesn't pay. This property is not always present. For example, in the case of national defense, the supplier cannot withhold protection from some citizens who pay for the taxes and provide it to others who do not. Non-payers simply can't be excluded. These two properties, non-rivalness and non-excludability, need not be found together, though in the case of national defense they are. Think about a swimming pool which is set up as a club with dues. Swimming services are generally non-rival in this case. The whole pool is available to every swimmer so long as it's not crowded. The swimming pool is excludable, though, since a membership can be checked at the gate. On the other hand, an urban freeway is not easily excludable because the installation of toll booths at every exit would be expensive and would slow travel. But it is rival because as each additional car enters the freeway, everyone must go a little slower. Now here's a table that shows these examples. Pure public goods are both non-rival and non-excludable. The benefits of public goods aren't necessarily the same for all citizens. Some people may get large benefits from defense, while others might be even worse off. Now, it's difficult to imagine how any type of market could supply the correct level of public goods, whether police protection, parks, freeways, or public housing. Collective decisions and government intervention are necessary for all cases involving public goods, as it is with all types of market failure. In fact, public goods create what's called a free rider problem, which simply means that people can enjoy the benefit of something without paying the costs. When this happens, too few goods are produced. In theory, there is an efficient level of public goods to produce. The solution to the problem was worked out by Paul Samuelson in the 1950s. It's only a theoretical solution, though, because it requires that the demand schedules for the public good be known for everyone, a highly unlikely situation. But here's how it works. Now imagine the following jungle story. Tarzan, Jane, and their pet chimpanzee Cheetah live in the jungle. They live off bananas which must be cultivated. Tarzan and Jane each work in their own private banana plantations, but Cheetah is incapable of farming and totally dependent on their generosity for her food. Believing in the principle that all primates are created equal, Tarzan and Jane wish to see that Cheetah is well fed. Now, a banana for Tarzan or for Jane is a private good. The more Tarzan eats, the fewer there are for Jane, and vice versa. But on the other hand, a banana for Cheetah has the properties of a pure public good. It's non-rival, since both Tarzan and Jane independently enjoy the benefits of a banana for Cheetah. Now, bananas for Cheetah are also non-excludable. Jane can't stop Tarzan's untroubled sleep if he fails to give a banana to Cheetah. And both have the incentive to free ride on the contributions of the other. Now, this is the source of the inefficiency, and it implies that Cheetah will receive too few bananas when Tarzan and Jane act independently. And this is a market failure. Suppose that Tarzan and Jane agree on a collective decision. That's a program of taxes and transfers to provide Cheetah with bananas. Now, what would be the best system? Can we define the efficient level of bananas for Cheetah? That's to say, can we correct for this market failure with public intervention? The key to answering this question is to understand how individual preferences should be aggregated for private and for public goods. Now, for private bananas, the market demand curve is obtained by horizontally adding Tarzan's and Jane's individual demand curves. It looks like this. Now, since private bananas are excludable, people are forced to reveal their preferences, so demand reflects willingness to pay. Let's suppose that jungle prices are measured in simoleons and that the marginal cost of producing a banana is 1 simoleon. Well, that's to say that there's a horizontal supply curve at S equals 1. Now, demand for bananas for Cheetah, however, is a public good. The trick to figuring the correct amount supplied is to vertically add up the demand curves. The reason is the fundamentally different nature of public goods. The same amount must be consumed by both Tarzan and Jane. Suppose that the status quo is that Cheetah receives 1 banana. Even in a private market, we've described the demand curve as a measure of consumers' willingness to pay. In this diagram, we can read how much Jane would be willing to pay for that outcome, which is 1 banana for Cheetah. From the vertical axis, she is willing to pay 1 simoleon, where Tarzan is only willing to pay 6/10 of a simoleon. Notice that at any level of public good, the benefit, in this case the warm glow from knowing that Cheetah is well fed, is available to both Tarzan and to Jane. But for each particular one, there's a different willingness to pay. In the private market, we add quantities consumed horizontally. For the public sector, we add willingness to pay vertically. The efficient solution is to equate the aggregated willingness to pay, or the public marginal benefit, with the marginal cost of production. In Cheetah's case, the cost of producing 1 banana is 1 simoleon. Now this implies that the efficient redistribution is 2 bananas, as indicated by the dot in the diagram. It also indicates that a fair tax contribution would be 67 cents, or simoleons, from Jane for each of Cheetah's bananas and 0.33 from Tarzan. Check that on the diagram. When her price is 0.67, Jane is willing to pay for 2 bananas. And when his price is 0.33, Tarzan's willing to pay for 2 bananas as well. Now, it might be argued that a fair way to assign taxes would be in accordance with willingness to pay. Jane would then contribute 1.33 bananas, which is 0.67 times 2, and Tarzan would contribute 0.67, and those are indicated by the boxes in the diagram. Alternatively, it may be argued that each should pay equal tax prices, which would be half a simoleon, and contribute them equally. Now this does seem fair, but it could lead to a conflict over the Cheetah Welfare Support Program. At the equal contributions of 0.5, Tarzan will want a smaller program than Jane, and she'll prefer the larger one, and those are indicated by the dots. In this way, it would be ideal if the government could discover the willingness to pay of all its citizens and assign taxes accordingly, because it would minimize political conflict. Unfortunately, the incentive to ride free is also an incentive for citizens to keep their preferences for public goods to themselves. So where do we go?
It's time once again for Smart Guy, Dumb Guy.
What's with this Tarzan thing, man? It's like out of nowhere we're doing Sesame Street, and I don't get it.
How come I'm not surprised?
He said,
Jane gives monkey banana. Tarzan sleep better.
so why is that not cool?
Okay, it's this way. Bananas for Cheetah are like public goods.
Public?
Right. A public good. Okay, so with a public good, if I consume it, that doesn't mean you can't. It's non-rival in consumption. But unlike a hot dog, which means if I eat it, you can't.
As if I'd want it. But, like, what's so wrong with giving a banana?
Okay, the point is, who gives the bananas to Cheetah?
Jane.
Right, so she pays, right?
Right.
Uh-huh. So, okay, so who gets the satisfaction of the banana?
The monkey.
Anyone else?
Well, I guess Tarzan and Jane do.
And who pays?
Jane. Hey, that's not fair. Tarzan gets to sleep better, and he doesn't even contribute. What a rip!
Yeah, it's called free riding. That's why they have to make a collective decision. Get together and figure out a tax where they can each contribute bananas for Cheetah.
Oh, yeah, the vertical addition of demand thing.
Yeah, correct.
You know, I just figured something out. Why doesn't Tarzan lie and say he doesn't care about the monkey, and that way he doesn't have to give so many bananas? Cool.
Don't you care about Cheetah?
Oh, yeah. I forgot. Wow. That's got to be tough, figuring out the banana thing.
Okay, so given a market failure, we have a need for public policy. Now, how do we go about figuring out how public goods will be provided? This is the topic of public choice. For centuries, majority rule has been the preferred way of making social choices, but it has theoretical faults. We can't guarantee that even in the ideal democracy we'll settle on a stable and logically consistent political equilibrium. Pairwise voting, which we mean by that is voting between two alternatives, may instead cycle endlessly through a list of 3 or more alternatives. Nor can we guarantee that whoever sets the political agenda will not also have the power to manipulate the result to achieve his or her personal goals. In the early 1950s, Kenneth Arrow recognized that stable and consistent social decisions can't be guaranteed under majority rule or any other social decision rule. To illustrate, let's look at a voting paradox. Here we have a 3-person society, person A, B, and C, with 3 candidates, candidates X, Y, and Z. The candidates don't vote in this election. Now, there are only 3 voters whose preference rankings over our 3 candidates are shown in this table. Voter A prefers X to Y and Y to Z. Voter B prefers Y to Z and Z to X. and voter C prefers candidate Z to X and X to Y. Even though none of these individual preferences are beyond the realm of imagination, pairwise elections run into logical inconsistency. When the first two candidates, X and Y, are on the ballot, the majority chooses X. And when Y and Z are on the ballot, the majority chooses Y. But, and here is the surprise, when X and Z are on the ballot, the majority chooses Z. This is the paradox. X beats Y and Y beats Z, but Z beats X. Here we can continue with more elections which never reach an equilibrium, but continue to cycle without a clear-cut decision. The problem suggested in this example is pervasive. It turns out there are no collective decision rules, majority rule, or any others, which don't permit a voting paradox. This is called the arrow impossibility theorem. It suggests that a certain amount of instability and uncertainty will always be present in government decision-making. Even though paradoxes exist, when voters are well informed about the future policies of all candidates, there might be stable voting solutions. For this to be the case, imagine that everyone knows exactly what policies maximize their utilities and which candidates stand closest to their positions. In theory, voters vote for candidates whose platforms most closely match their own. If there is just one issue, then the median voter theorem predicts that politicians who express what the median voter wants will be elected, and those who accommodate the extremes won't. An interesting corollary is that political parties will converge to the center of opinion, and that may be a large reason why we see so little difference in the platforms of Republicans and Democrats on so many political issues. Of course, voters are not always well informed. They simply don't know what the government should be doing. And realizing that a vote is unlikely to be decisive, the rational citizen has little motivation to devote much time to gathering better information. So economics predicts that voters would rarely devote much time to becoming informed. In election campaigns, political candidates attempt to convert uncertain voters with claims of personal benefits of their proposed policies, but with little mention of the associated costs. When a group is well informed about a specific issue in which they have a strong interest, often because they are employed in a specific industry, a candidate may go beyond vague ideology and tailor a campaign to address specific concerns. Asymmetric information is the key. Much of politics involves the subsidized provision of carefully selected information by interested parties in an attempt to influence public sector outcomes.
My name is Ronald Reagan. Last year, the contributions of 16 million Americans to the crusade for freedom made possible the World Freedom Bell, symbol of hope and freedom to the communist-dominated peoples of Eastern Europe.
We've seen that the democratic outcome is far from perfect. Voting paradoxes imply that the election results can be manipulated by whomever sets the agenda. Another problem is that considerably fewer than all eligible voters go to the polls. And when they do vote, it's often in the absence of complete and accurate information about the ballot issues. We should also recognize that officials, whether elected or appointed, have their own objectives on which we can differ from those of the median voter. Quite often, public decisions are determined or at least influenced in ways other than voting. Examples are found in political power of lobbyists for special interest groups and the influence of campaign contributions over elected officials. The authority to achieve collective benefits can also be distorted to benefit the politicians in power at the expense of the voters. These are some of the many ways in which governments can fail to achieve the efficiency what we know is theoretically possible. But that's the reality of market failure. In the next few segments, we'll explore how economists suggest market-based remedies to these sorts of problems. So stay tuned.